What about the background? What is the background section? Best way to think about the background section is it's where you describe the company you've looked at, or the country you've studied, or the region you're interested in. Sometimes the industry that you're studying, you might want to offer some descriptions of that, some information about that. Right? And in some cases, it's actually even about the managerial practice. You might think that that goes in theory, but in some cases, you're actually studying using a different kind of sociological theory, the effects of a certain managerial practice. Right? So you might use discourse analysis to study lean management. Right? And if you're doing that, then you're going to have to explain what lean management is to the reader in the background section. Then you'll introduce discourse analysis in your theory section. Right? So the background is a place where you provide the reader with information, and you're actually assuming that the reader doesn't know these things. Again, think about this student, this very serious, very admirable student that you're imagining writing for, right? They've read all the same theories that you've read, right? So that's nothing new there. And they have, they've had the same conversations that you have. They have some of the same interests. They have a lot of the same popular background knowledge, but they're missing something. And one of the things they're missing is the information about your empirical object, right? So exactly the company that you went and studied, or exactly the industry that you went and studied, which may not have been part of the course, right? So you're saying, if I was to imagine explaining this to one of my fellow students, what would they need to know that they probably don't know, right? So that's the thing you want to make sure that you're providing information to a reader that will need it to make sense of the rest of your paper, right? You talk about the founding of the company that you studied, or the organization of it. How many teams do they have, even though you've only looked at one team, right? But here's an important thing. The basis of the background section is going to be publicly available sources, right? So you're not going to be writing based on your data. It's a very important thing that you may say something about the company. Obviously, your data will give you information about the company, but that doesn't go in the background section. That goes in your analysis section. In the background section, you're working on that part and not your analysis if you're drawing on publicly available sources. So this could be newspapers. It could, to a certain extent, be the scientific literature, but I would save that mainly for the theory section, right? But you're going to be drawing it out of, it could be company reports that are, of course, also publicly available, right? Annual reports, right? Good, so does that roughly, we know what we're talking about here. Company, region, industry, even the product sometimes, you're studying a fancy new technology and you're going to describe that product to the reader just to make sure that they know the details of how it works and how it was invented, even though this is publicly available and doesn't come from your data. So the theory is very, very different on this point, right? Because your theory doesn't draw on publicly available sources, that is, sources that are available to the entire public. It draws on the scientific literature that brings you and your reader together, right? So it's not something your reader might have happened to read. It's something your reader is kind of obligated to have read, right? So one of the important things when you're writing your theory section is not to write it like a textbook, right? Don't explain this down to the reader like the reader doesn't know. What you're really doing here is you're reminding the reader of what the theory says, because you're going to make use of these theoretically enriched concepts, right? You're going to make use of these notions that allow you to see things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see, but you know that your reader, because it's the most serious and most admirable student in your class, understands these concepts perfectly well, so you don't have to explain them from the ground up. You just have to make them precise. You have to say, here is how I'm going to make use of these concepts that you already understand, right? So you're activating the reader's knowledge competence, right? You're activating their basis to use these concepts, right? Their conceptual apparatus, if you will, right? You're saying, turn this part of your conceptual apparatus on, is what you're saying, right? You've got this part of your machinery, we're going to draw that into this machine that we're building here, right? These are the skills I need you to use, dear reader, right? And why are we doing that? What's the purpose of that? Well, it is to build expectations in the mind of the reader. And these are very formal expectations. You think of the entire conceptual apparatus of a theory is really just a system of expectations, right? Once you've said you're going to study app development in Denmark, right? The independent app developers in Denmark. Once you've said you're going to study that, you've just said, well, they exist. You can publicly document that, right, in your background section. So there are these app developers, right? Now, suppose you then say, well, I'm going to use sense-making theory, right, to study how they make sense of their situation. Well, at that moment, either the reader knows what sense-making theory is, right, and will be able to then immediately have some expectations about how this object is going to be studied and what the analysis will show, or the reader doesn't know what that is, and then you're in the wrong discipline, right? If the reader is not going to know what your theory is, if you have to explain it from the ground up, then you're not writing in the right discipline, right? So you're going to be activating the reader's knowledge of a theory in the theory section. Does that make sense? Right? So always think about the reason I'm writing the theory section is to activate my reader's expectations of the object of analysis, right? So I've already given them a whole bunch of information about the background, and now I'm going to get them to expect something in particular, right? I'm going to get them to expect that retrospective processes of sense-making have had an important consequence for the overall strategy of these small app developers, right? That's the kind of expectation I'm setting up. If you're working more quantitatively, if you're working in kind of a classic quantitative tradition, what you're really doing here is constructing your null hypothesis, right? What you're doing is you're reading the literature to find out what we in the community would expect of this object if there was no particular effect that we're looking for, right? Does that make sense? And out of that will come some testable hypotheses, right? So out of this basic set of expectations will come some basic hypotheses. Now, we'll skip the method for a second because it's easier to explain if we start with what the analysis is supposed to do. The method serves a very specific purpose, but it's easier to understand if we know what we're trying to do with the analysis. Of course, the analysis is going to be based on your data. You know you're writing the analysis part of your paper if you're drawing on your data. So this is all the information that you have collected in some orderly and methodical way to make sure that you have a basis for saying something about the object. Right? Now, obviously, this is an interesting point. Again, if you're doing discourse analysis or something like that, it's quite possible that you've used the public media, newspapers and so forth in your background, but you've also constructed a data set, say, of newspaper articles from 2001 to 2011, right? And so that data set is what you're actually, that's the data. So whenever you're writing about that, right, you are now doing your analysis, whereas if you were just using newspaper coverage of some event to inform the reader, you're writing the background, right? So just remember, you construct your data set, you know what you're talking about when you say this is my data, right? And when you're basing your claims on that, you're writing the analysis, right? Think about it in those terms. Some people call this the results section, right? And some people even, there's a kind of, I'll talk about the discussion section in a very specific sense, but some people will also say, well, there's a discussion of the data, right? But I'll talk about it in a slightly different way. But results, analysis, it's the empirical part of your paper, right? And it's where your reader doesn't know, right? The reader doesn't have access to this. The reader needs you to tell them this. Why are you writing the analysis section? What's the purpose of writing the analysis section? If we think about the theory as having set up a bunch of expectations, right? What do you imagine that we're going to be doing with the analysis? If the theory has set up expectations, the analysis will
framework debunk the expectations.
Exactly. It's interesting you say both, and that's exactly right. Most people say we should satisfy those expectations, right? We've set up these expectations, and now we should be very positive-minded, and we should make sure we fulfill those expectations. Why else would we have raised these expectations, right? But in fact, in science, it's almost the opposite, right? So what you want to do in your analysis is you want to find out, you want to present your data in such a way that it challenges our expectations, right? So really, I usually say that writing an analysis is the art of constructing an artful disappointment, right? It's an artful disappointment of the reader's expectations of the object, not their expectations of your intelligence, right? You're just disappointing them as far as they thought they had this theory that already understood this practice, and you're showing them that the real world is actually more interesting than our theory already predicts, right? So, which is, again, if we want to compare it to quantitative work, it's like saying, well, we have a null hypothesis, but it turns out that there's an effect here we hadn't considered, right, that we hadn't thought of. Yeah? So we want the data, we want the analysis to challenge our expectations. And so we want to get good at making this disappointment, right? And that tells us something about what the method is supposed to do. That's where we really can see why we need this method. Because in real life, how do we deal with disappointment? If you're me, you try to forget it as quickly as possible. You just kind of put it out of your mind. You push it away, right? Didn't happen, right? You try to deny it, right? And in science, we do something similar. We have these beautiful theories that we've really worked hard to learn, right? And they really help us to understand the world. And then this data comes along, and it tries to get us to rethink our theories and think in different ways, challenges us. It's kind of irritating. So we try to push it away. And the way we do that is to say, there's got to be something wrong with this study, right? There's got to be something wrong with the data, right? There's got to be some argument we have for rejecting the basis on which this disappointment has been offered us, so that we don't actually have to face the disappointment of our theory, right? That's how we want to react. And of course, that's why the method section is there, because it's there to close off that opportunity, right? It's there to preempt the desire on the part of the reader to reject your data in order to save the theory, right? So the reader has an investment in the theory, wants to maintain the theory, is going to try to reject your data. So what you do in your method section is you present yourself, right? You draw on what you did to collect the data, the care that you took in making sure you checked for sources of error, right? The effort you made to make sure the data set was representative. You present all the careful things you did to construct this data set in order to get the reader to trust your data, right? You're trying to build up trust with the reader in your data set. Does that make sense? All right? So the basis on which the source of your method is yourself. You might think it's your methods handbooks and so forth, and of course you're drawing on them for tips and guidance and so forth, and you're citing them for authority, because that also builds up trust. But what you're really doing is telling the reader what you did and how careful you are, right? And how cleverly you saw the mistakes that could be made and have worked out ways of avoiding them, right? So these are the kinds of things you just want to make sure you just intelligently, openly, honestly, you're trying to get the reader to trust you. So you explain to them what weaknesses your study probably had, what limitations it had, right? And then you say, well, but what are its strengths, right? Despite that, what are its strengths? And then this is how much you can trust me, right? You haven't objected in the way that I expected you to. Some of you would say, I don't think that we do it in this way in our field. I don't think we test hypotheses in this way. I don't think we're always challenging the theory. We use the theory in a more grounded way, people would say, right? That we use the theory in a much more pleasant manner, actually, some would say. And for you, I have an alternative. Right? Marshall McLuhan, the great Canadian media theorist, has this great thing he says. If you don't like my ideas, I've got others. You know? And so if you don't like this, I actually do have another idea. It's completely different. It's not completely different. It's a little bit different.